The moment they locked my road, they unknowingly locked themselves out of their own future. That was the first thought that crossed my mind when I rolled toward the front gate of my ranch just after sunrise and found thick iron chains stretched across my private access road. A brand new metal sign hung from the chain in bright reflective letters declaring that the Homeowners Association had assumed control of the roadway and that unauthorized entry was prohibited. I stopped my truck, lowered the window, and simply stared for a few seconds. I had driven this road nearly every day for more than 30 years. My father had driven it before me, and my grandfather had helped carve its first path across the Texas hills long before the subdivision even existed. Yet overnight someone had decided they owned something that had never belonged to them. Most people probably expected me to lose my temper, grab a pair of bolt cutters, or start shouting into my phone. Instead, I parked the truck, stepped out, took several photographs from different angles, recorded a slow video showing every chain, every warning sign, every fresh post driven into the ground, and even the tire tracks left by the installation crew. Evidence always lasts longer than anger. As I finished recording, a white luxury SUV pulled up on the opposite side of the chains. The driver's window lowered just enough for Victoria Collins, the president of the Homeowners Association, to smile with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing victory is already guaranteed. She politely informed me that the road now fell under the association's authority because it served the expanding residential development beyond my ranch. According to her, I would need written permission from the board before using it again. She expected an argument. She expected threats. She probably expected me to make a mistake. Instead, I simply asked one question. "Did your attorney tell you to do this?" Her smile faded for only a fraction of a second before she answered that their legal team had reviewed everything. That tiny hesitation told me far more than her words ever could. I wished her a pleasant morning, returned to my truck, and drove back across my pasture using an older maintenance trail that very few people even knew existed. By the time I reached my office inside the barn, I had already decided what my first call would be. It was not to the sheriff's office. It was not to the county commissioners. It was to Charles Bennett, the property attorney who had helped my family organize decades of land records after my father passed away. When he answered, I described exactly what I had seen without exaggeration. Before I finished speaking, he interrupted me with a question that caught me completely off guard. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "Did they chain the original ranch road, or did they chain the recorded access easement?" I looked across the room toward an old wooden cabinet that held maps my grandfather refused to throw away, and for the first time that morning, I realized this situation might be much bigger than a simple dispute over a road. Charles Bennett arrived at my ranch less than an hour later carrying nothing but a leather briefcase that looked older than I was. He did not ask to see the chains first. Instead, he walked straight into my office and pointed toward the tall wooden cabinet where generations of my family's records had been carefully stored. My grandfather believed paper survived longer than promises, so every deed, survey, tax receipt, and engineering sketch had been preserved inside labeled folders dating back almost 100 years. Charles removed several maps from the lowest drawer and carefully spread them across my dining table. One map was yellow with age, another had county survey stamps from the 1970s, and a third showed the subdivision long before the first house had ever been built. He studied them silently before tracing one narrow line with his finger. "This is the original ranch road," he said. "It has existed far longer than the development." Then he pointed to another document filed decades later. "And this is the recorded access easement that everyone keeps talking about." I leaned closer and immediately noticed something I had never paid much attention to before. The two lines were not identical. They crossed the same property for part of the distance, but they separated near the entrance where the chains had been installed. Charles looked directly at me. "Tell me exactly where they placed those chains." I showed him the photographs from my phone. He zoomed in, measured the location against the survey, and slowly smiled. "Interesting," he whispered. "Very interesting." He explained that if the chains blocked the original privately owned ranch road instead of the recorded easement, Then the homeowners association had physically occupied private property without establishing any legal authority to do so. If they believed they controlled the easement, they had chosen the wrong location entirely. Before I could respond, Charles asked another unexpected question. When is the grand opening for their new expansion? I remembered the banners hanging around the subdivision entrance, and the advertisements mailed throughout the county. 3 days from now, I answered. Charles nodded without looking surprised. That explains why they acted so quickly. He believed someone wanted complete control of the entrance before hundreds of visitors arrived for the event. Just then my phone rang. The caller identified himself as Daniel Harper, a licensed county surveyor whom I had hired years earlier during a fence boundary dispute. Before I even explained the situation, he said he had already received an unusual request from someone representing the development asking whether old survey monuments along my property could be ignored because they were supposedly outdated. Daniel refused, and now he wanted to know why anyone was suddenly interested in boundaries that had remained unchanged for decades. I asked if he could visit the ranch that afternoon. He agreed immediately. As I ended the call, Charles quietly folded the oldest map and handed it to me. On the back was a faded handwritten note from my grandfather that simply read, "Never forget which road came first." I had always assumed it was sentimental advice, but standing there with those maps spread across my table, I began to wonder whether my grandfather had left that message because he already knew someone would eventually try to claim what was never theirs. Daniel Harper arrived before noon driving a dusty county survey truck with bright orange equipment cases stacked neatly in the bed. Unlike most people, he did not begin by looking at the chains or the warning sign. He walked straight to an old brass survey monument that sat half buried beneath the grass nearly 20 feet away from the entrance. After brushing away decades of dirt with a small hand broom, he smiled as if greeting an old friend. "Nobody has moved this marker since it was set," he said. "That is good news." He unpacked his surveying equipment, while Charles Bennett watched every measurement without saying a word. I stood nearby holding copies of the old maps my grandfather had preserved, trying to understand why everyone suddenly seemed more interested in tiny metal markers than the heavy chains blocking my road. Within an hour Daniel had established a complete reference line across the entrance. He compared modern satellite coordinates with historical county records and then looked back toward the chains. "They are standing in the wrong place," he finally said. "Not just by a few inches. They are several feet inside your privately owned property." Charles did not celebrate. Instead, he immediately asked the question that had been bothering him all morning. "Can the development legally function without crossing this property?" Daniel paused before answering. "Not from what I can see." He explained that every approved access route shown on the most recent development plans eventually depended on this entrance. There were other dirt trails in the surrounding hills, but none satisfied county requirements for emergency access, utility maintenance, or public traffic. If this entrance became unavailable, the entire expansion project could be delayed until another compliant route was designed, reviewed, and approved. I looked toward the growing neighborhood beyond the trees where workers were already decorating the entrance with banners announcing the grand opening in just 2 days. They had invested months preparing for that event, yet they appeared completely unaware that everything depended on a narrow strip of land my family had owned for generations. Before anyone spoke again, Daniel reached into another equipment case and removed a faded survey notebook from many years earlier. "I almost forgot this," he admitted. The notebook belonged to a retired county surveyor who had trained him decades before. Inside were handwritten field notes describing the original property boundaries exactly as my grandfather's map had shown them. One page contained a sentence that immediately caught Charles's attention. "Developer advised not to relocate entrance until ownership questions are resolved." Charles slowly read the sentence twice before asking Daniel whether that recommendation had ever been followed. Daniel shook his head. "I have never seen this note included in the official development file." That single statement changed everything I thought I knew. Until then I believed the homeowners association had simply made an arrogant decision. Now another possibility emerged. Someone involved in planning the development might have known about the ownership problem years earlier and chosen to move forward anyway. As we packed away the equipment, Charles quietly told me not to confront anyone and not to remove the chains. He wanted the situation to remain exactly as it was for one more day because he intended to file something at the county courthouse first thing the next morning. I asked him what he had discovered, but he only smiled and said, "If this old notebook is authentic, tomorrow will change the entire story." The county courthouse opened at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, and Charles Bennett was already waiting on the front steps holding a neatly organized stack of documents. He handed me a folder containing certified copies of my family's property deeds, the historical surveys, Daniel Harper's preliminary measurements, and several county records that had not been reviewed together in decades. "Today is not about winning," Charles said as we walked inside. "Today is about making sure every decision after this point is based on the correct record." That sentence stayed with me as we met the county clerk, who carefully compared the historical documents against the current land records stored in the digital archive. After nearly an hour of reviewing maps and legal descriptions, she quietly frowned. One reference connecting the subdivision expansion to the access route pointed to a document number that no longer existed in the archive. She searched again, then checked older microfilm records stored in the basement. The missing reference had once been part of the official file, but it had somehow disappeared during a records conversion years earlier. Charles did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, he requested that the clerk certify exactly which documents were present and which referenced records could no longer be located. By late morning we left the courthouse with certified copies confirming the incomplete file. From there we drove directly to the county planning office, where Daniel Harper joined us with updated survey measurements. The planning director welcomed us into a conference room and listened carefully while Charles explained the property boundaries without raising his voice or making dramatic claims. Daniel placed the survey map on the table and pointed to the entrance. The planning director studied it for several minutes before asking a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. "If this entrance is privately owned, where is the approved secondary access route for emergency services?" Nobody answered because the approved plans did not show one. The director opened the subdivision file and slowly turned page after page before finally admitting that every approved drawing relied on the same entrance crossing my property. He immediately scheduled an internal review for the following morning, only one day before the development's public grand opening. As we prepared to leave, Charles received a phone call from an unknown number. He stepped into a hallway to answer it, and remained there much longer than expected. When he returned, his expression had changed completely. He quietly told me someone wanted to deliver a sealed storage box that had belonged to a retired civil engineer involved with the original subdivision planning nearly 20 years earlier. The caller refused to identify himself but insisted the box contained documents that had never reached the official county file. The meeting was arranged for that evening at a small historical museum on the edge of town. I asked Charles whether we should trust an anonymous source. He looked at the certified county records still resting under his arm and calmly replied, "Anonymous evidence means nothing until it matches verified facts, but if those papers explain why an entire document vanished from the archive, then we may finally understand whether this was simply a mistake or whether someone planned for this entrance to be used long before the first family ever moved into that neighborhood." The anonymous meeting took place just after sunset inside the archive room of the County Historical Museum, where dusty shelves held forgotten maps, engineering drawings, and handwritten records from generations of local families. The man who called Charles never revealed his name. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and placed a weathered storage box on the table without saying much more than, "These papers belong where the truth belongs." Before either of us could ask another question, he quietly walked out the side entrance and disappeared into the evening. Charles immediately photographed the unopened box before carefully breaking the old tape seal. Inside were engineering reports, correspondence between county planners and the original developer, folded blueprints, and a leather notebook with the name of Richard Lawson, a retired civil engineer who had worked on the first expansion proposal nearly 20 years earlier. We spent the next hour organizing every document by date instead of reading them randomly. Charles always believed that the order of paperwork often revealed more than the paperwork itself. Halfway through the stack, I found a letter addressed to the original developer recommending that a permanent public access road be constructed before any additional phases of the subdivision were approved. Another document explained that relying on my family's private ranch road created long-term legal uncertainty because ownership had never been transferred. The recommendation was clear, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. Yet another letter, written only a few months later, discussed moving forward with construction while future access concerns would supposedly be addressed later. They never were. The final pages contained field sketches showing several possible alternative routes that would have completely avoided my property, but every option had been marked as rejected because building them would cost substantially more money. Charles leaned back in his chair and quietly said, "This changes the story. Until that moment we believed the Homeowners Association had created the problem by placing the chains across my road. Now we understood something much larger. The access issue had existed before a single family purchased a home there. The board members may have inherited a mistake that began years before they were ever elected. That did not excuse what they had done, but it completely changed who might ultimately be responsible." Early the next morning, the day scheduled for the subdivision's grand opening celebration, we delivered certified copies of the newly discovered records to the county planning director before sunrise. By the time workers began setting up tents, balloons, and welcome signs, county officials were already reviewing the engineering correspondence inside the administration building. Daniel Harper called while I was driving back toward my ranch. His voice sounded calm, but there was urgency behind every word. He told me the planning director had temporarily suspended final event approval until the access documentation could be verified. That single decision immediately placed hundreds of scheduled guests, contractors, vendors, and investors into uncertainty. As I reached the entrance to my property, I saw long lines of vehicles beginning to gather near the chain roadway while Victoria Collins stood confidently speaking with organizers who still believed everything would begin on schedule. Then my phone rang once again. It was Charles. He said the county had reached its first official conclusion, but before anyone announced it publicly, he wanted me to return to the planning office immediately because the next document they had just uncovered might determine not only who owned the road, but whether the entire expansion had ever satisfied the county's own approval requirements. By the time I reached the county planning office, the parking lot was overflowing with contractors, engineers, attorneys, and confused event organizers trying to understand why the grand opening had suddenly stopped moving forward. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was calm but noticeably different from the day before. Nobody was arguing anymore. Everyone was reading documents. The planning director motioned for Charles Bennett and me to take our seats before sliding a newly discovered file across the table. "We found this in an archived project storage room this morning," he said. The folder contained inspection notes that had never been scanned into the county database. Attached to the front was a memorandum signed by the planning department nearly 2 decades earlier. The memorandum explained that final approval for future phases of the subdivision depended upon verification of permanent legal access before construction expanded beyond the original neighborhood. Charles carefully compared the memorandum with the engineering letters from the anonymous storage box. Every date matched perfectly. Every reference pointed to the same unresolved issue. Daniel Harper quietly placed another survey map beside the memorandum, and explained that every updated measurement confirmed the entrance crossed my family's property exactly as the historical records described. The planning director leaned back in his chair and admitted something none of us expected to hear. He explained that the county had assumed the access requirement had been satisfied years ago because every later inspection referenced earlier approvals without repeating the original verification. In other words, each department believed someone else had already confirmed the legal access, and that assumption had quietly continued from one project phase to the next. It was not a single dramatic decision that created the problem. It was years of paperwork relying on previous paperwork without anyone returning to the original question. That revelation completely changed how I viewed the situation. Victoria Collins and the current Homeowners Association board suddenly appeared less like the architects of the mistake and more like people who inherited a problem they never fully understood. Their decision to chain my road was still entirely their responsibility, but the deeper issue reached much farther back than any current board member. Just then the conference room door opened, and Victoria herself walked inside accompanied by the developer's attorney. She looked confident at first, but her expression shifted as she noticed the historical maps spread across the table beside certified county records and Daniel's survey equipment. Instead of arguing, she asked a simple question. "Is the event cancelled?" The planning director answered carefully. He explained that no final decision had been made, but until the county determined whether the legal access requirement had ever been satisfied, he could not authorize the expansion to open. Silence filled the room for several long seconds. The developer's attorney quietly requested copies of every newly discovered document. Charles agreed immediately because every page had already been certified and entered into the official record that morning. As Victoria slowly gathered her notes, she looked directly at me for the first time since this dispute began and said, "If someone hid this from everyone, then we have all been working from the wrong story." Before I could respond, a county employee hurried into the room carrying another sealed archive envelope that had just arrived from the state records warehouse. The label identified it as the original final review package for the subdivision expansion, and according to the accompanying inventory sheet, it contained one document that nobody in the room had ever seen before. The planning director carefully broke the seal on the archive envelope, while everyone around the conference table watched in complete silence. Inside was a thick collection of original review documents that had been stored at the state records warehouse for years. One by one, each paper was compared against the county file already spread across the table. Most of the documents matched perfectly until the planning director reached the final page. He stopped reading, adjusted his glasses, and quietly passed the document to Charles Bennett. Charles studied it for several moments before sliding it toward me. Across the bottom of the page was a handwritten condition that had never appeared in any county copy we had reviewed. Before the subdivision expansion could receive permanent approval, the developer was required to obtain either a recorded public access agreement with my family or construct an independent county-approved entrance before opening additional phases. Neither option had ever been completed. Daniel Harper immediately compared the handwritten condition with the engineering correspondence recovered from the Historical Museum. Every date aligned. Every reference supported the same conclusion. The requirement had existed from the very beginning. The planning director looked genuinely surprised. He explained that the county archive contained only summary approvals while the state warehouse had preserved the complete review package, including handwritten review conditions that had somehow never been transferred into the local records system. Charles calmly asked whether the county could ignore an original approval condition that had never been formally removed. The planning director answered without hesitation. "No. If this document is authentic, we have to treat it as controlling until legal counsel determines otherwise." Within minutes the county attorney joined the meeting by video conference. After reviewing scanned copies of the documents, she advised the planning department to suspend authorization for the new expansion until the access issue could be fully resolved through the proper legal process. Nobody celebrated. Even Victoria Collins remained quiet because the evidence no longer supported anyone's assumptions. She slowly admitted that every homeowners association board she had served on believed the entrance belonged to the development because that was how it had always been presented in annual meetings and maintenance budgets. No one had questioned the original paperwork because everyone trusted the files they inherited. That admission changed my opinion of her once again. She had made a serious mistake by placing chains across private property. But she had also been relying on decades of incomplete information that stretched back long before her time on the board. As the meeting concluded, the planning director announced that a formal public hearing would be held the following week so every document, survey, engineering report, and property record could become part of the official public record before any future decision was made. Reporters waiting outside immediately learned that the grand opening had been postponed indefinitely pending legal review. As Charles and I walked toward the parking lot, my phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. He had continued examining the survey notebook from his retired mentor, and discovered one final handwritten reference that neither of us had noticed before. The note identified a living witness who had personally attended the original planning meetings nearly 20 years earlier and who, according to public records, still lived less than 30 miles from my ranch. The week passed faster than I expected, and on the morning of the public hearing the county administration building was already filled with homeowners, engineers, reporters, surveyors, and local residents who wanted to understand how a single private road had become the center of one of the largest planning disputes our county had seen in years. I arrived with Charles Bennett carrying only one folder because every important document had already been entered into the official record. Daniel Harper met us outside and quietly introduced me to the man mentioned in the old survey notebook. His name was Thomas Reynolds, an 82-year-old retired transportation planner who had attended the original subdivision planning meetings nearly 20 years earlier. He walked slowly, but his memory was remarkably clear. Before the hearing even began, he told us he still remembered warning everyone that depending on my family's ranch road would eventually create serious legal problems unless ownership was resolved first. He said cost concerns had repeatedly delayed construction of an independent entrance even though several alternative routes had already been designed. When the hearing officially opened, the planning director carefully presented the certified property records, the historical surveys, the recovered engineering correspondence, the original review package from the State Archive, and Daniel's updated measurements. Every document supported the same conclusion. The legal question had never truly disappeared. It had simply been carried forward from one project phase to another without being fully resolved. Then Thomas Reynolds took the podium. He explained that no one at the original meetings intended to ignore property rights. The independent access road had always been part of the long-term plan, but each time budgets tightened the project was postponed with the expectation that it would be completed later. Later slowly became years, and years eventually became decades. His testimony changed the atmosphere inside the room. Instead of searching for a single person to blame, everyone began to understand how repeated short-term decisions had gradually produced one large problem. When Victoria Collins addressed the hearing, she acknowledged that placing chains across my private property had been a serious mistake based on incomplete assumptions inherited from previous boards. She formally apologized for acting without verifying the historical property records and announced that the Homeowners Association would immediately remove every unauthorized barrier at its own expense. Hearing those words surprised me more than any legal argument had. The county attorney then explained that future expansion could not continue until a permanent public access solution fully complying with the original approval conditions had been designed and approved. The recommendation passed without opposition. Construction on the new phase would remain suspended, while county engineers began evaluating the alternative entrance routes first proposed nearly 20 years earlier. As the hearing concluded, several homeowners approached me, not with anger, but with sincere questions about the old ranch and its history. Many admitted they had never known the entrance crossed private land because they had purchased their homes believing every road belonged to the subdivision. Walking toward the parking lot, I felt something I had not expected when this all began. I was no longer standing across from an entire community. I was standing beside people who had finally been given the complete story. Just as Charles and I reached my truck, the planning director hurried outside carrying one final envelope. He smiled for the first time all week before handing it to me and saying, "The county commissioners finished their decision this morning. I think you will want to read this before anyone else does." I opened the envelope before climbing into my truck because after everything that had happened, waiting even a few more minutes no longer made sense. Inside was the signed decision from the county commissioners. After reviewing the complete historical record, the certified property deeds, the original planning documents, the recovered engineering correspondence, the survey evidence, and the testimony presented during the public hearing, they unanimously confirmed that my family's ownership of the access road remained valid and had never been transferred, dedicated, or abandoned. They further directed the planning department to require the developer to construct an independent county-approved entrance before any additional expansion could move forward. Until that work was completed, no new phase could receive final authorization. The decision also instructed the Homeowners Association to remove every chain, sign, and obstruction placed on my property without permission and to update all community records so future boards would not repeat the same mistake. Charles Bennett quietly smiled after reading the final page. "This is exactly how the system is supposed to work," he said. "Facts, records, and patience." 2 days later I drove to the entrance and found maintenance crews carefully removing the heavy chains that had started this entire dispute. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The workers simply completed the job and left the property exactly as they had found it before the barriers appeared. Later that afternoon, Victoria Collins requested a brief meeting. She arrived alone carrying a folder instead of a list of demands. She apologized once more for acting without confirming the property records and handed me copies of the revised Homeowners Association documents acknowledging that the road belonged to my family and was not subject to association control. She also explained that the board had voted to cooperate fully with county officials while the developer designed the new public entrance required under the original approval conditions. I thanked her for correcting the record because, by that point, restoring the truth mattered more to me than proving anyone wrong. Over the following months, construction crews began building the independent access road that engineers had recommended almost 20 years earlier. It cost far more than it would have cost back then, but when the work was finally completed, emergency vehicles, homeowners, contractors, and visitors all had a permanent legal entrance that no longer depended on private property. My ranch returned to being exactly what it had always been, a quiet piece of land that my grandfather had protected with careful records instead of loud arguments. Before placing the old maps back into the cabinet, I unfolded the handwritten note he had left decades earlier. It still read, "Never forget which road came first." For the first time I fully understood what he meant. Roads can be covered with fresh pavement, new signs, and modern plans, but ownership does not disappear simply because people stop asking questions. In the end, nobody won because someone was louder, wealthier, or more powerful. The outcome belonged to the people who preserved the facts, respected the law, and allowed the truth to be verified one document at a time. Every chain was removed, every record was corrected, every future homeowner received accurate information, and the community moved forward with a legal solution that should have been built from the very beginning. Whenever I drive past the new entrance today, I no longer think about the morning I found my road blocked. I think about how a forgotten survey marker, an old notebook, and my grandfather's patience quietly protected everything he intended to leave behind.